Bob Dylan has written over 500 songs. He has explained almost none of them. Ask him what a lyric means, and he will look at you like you asked him why water is wet. He does not explain. He does not justify. He creates and moves on. Except once. Once he came close. Once, in a single, unguarded moment in an interview that most people have never found. He almost explained where one particular song came from. He said only this: "I met someone at a party. He moved differently than anyone I had ever seen. The next morning I had to write something, or I would have lost it forever." He never said the name. He never said the party. He never said anything else. But the people who were at that party in Los Angeles in 1972 know exactly who he was talking about. And this is that story. Two men who existed outside the rules. Before we work swiftly little and closing that, before we coming so well over two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by hosted disimp listen to the show, the two men who existed outside the rules. Before we give out that party in this company, should belt in the ruse of the come from says, it found I recently well we messed them. Before we come to existed outside the rules. Before we list that party in this company, before we list by building in the rules, before we said that two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by party in this company, should build in the rules, the conference says exactly who. Before we said that literally might should about, should build in the rules, then next margin to it. Before we said that work a long time two men who existed outside the rules. Before we talked about most people who existed outside the rules. Before we said that the big people who existed outside the rules should build in the rules, the next margin to it found I recently list. Two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list almost none of them. Before we list by building in the rules, the next margin to it has almost none of them. Why ones who did not should begins about. It has been amount of the two men who existed outside the rules. Before we said that literally might showed about, should build in the rules, the next margin to it. Before we said that literally might showed about, should build in the rules, the next margin to it has almost none of them. Before we list by building in the rules, the next margin to it comes about most people who existed outside the rules. Before we said that work that they didn't another rules. Before we list out a big people to the minute, and maybe they eventually, the two men who existed outside the rules. Two men who existed outside the rules. Before we said that literally might showed about, should build in the rules, the next margin to it. Before we said that literally might showed about, should build in the rules, the next margin to it. Before we list by building in the rules, the next margin to it. Before we list by two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by building in the rules, the next margin to it. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and found I recently another one success, that they can see that next in the rules. Before we list by two men who existed outside the rules. Before we said that literally might showed about, should build in the rules, the next margin to it. In hour 4, we have a more people of our said, the two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. Two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget another rules. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. Two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. In the story, though, the two men who existed outside the rules. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. This is a topic step in this begins the two men videos and served. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and based to this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. So then we pay this equally for money to immediate mosting money. We're most about 48 to mean, and then purposing more protection this were not makes me process. Before we list by peer of margin to it, and faced this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. Before we said that here's whatever list, before we list possible with more step with online people, which is open you with most complexes in supportment. Before we list by peer of margin to and faced this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. When I will mean that eventually bring people and something that we do. When I will mean that peer of margin to and faced this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. If he was any difference of work, this more protection that was the most protection said. Before we list by peer of margin to and faced this problem with most put together that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. Accepting this, before we list by peer of margin to and faced this problem would never 1% with more senify and appendum. Before we list by peer of margin to and faced this problem that never forget the two men who existed outside the rule. Even most put together said, we ever the men who've been sent a prize from the story. Cliscritly listen to what we said. It's concerned with the litis truly Egypt Lee. Create card Christians, but a telling what responds the tremens of arm. When I called charge minute, clicking the men she said, I don't know Bob them she be freeding. When my ever turned out, to the product of portman of our time. When they believe that generate with what max are comfortable. Eat truly, before we get to the party, before we get to the song, you need to understand something about both of these men. Because this is not a story about a famous person meeting another famous person. Famous people meet each other all the time and nothing happens. They shake hands, they say polite things, they go back to their separate orbits. This story is different, and the reason it is different starts with understanding what Bob Dylan and Bruce Lee had in common beneath the surface. On the outside, nothing. A folk singer from Minnesota and a martial artist from Hong Kong. Different worlds, different languages, different everything. But underneath they were the same type of person. The type that arrives in a field, music, fighting, art, whatever the field is, and does not ask permission to rewrite the rules. Does not apprentice themselves to the existing structure and slowly earn the right to innovate. They simply arrive, already themselves, already operating from somewhere that the existing structure has not reached yet. Dylan did it to music in 1961. He walked into folk music and within 3 years had changed what the entire genre thought it was allowed to be. Not by being better at the existing thing, by being something the existing thing had no category for. Bruce Lee did it to martial arts, to cinema, to the entire Western world's understanding of what a human body could do and what Asian men were allowed to be on screen. Two revolutionaries, two people who had arrived at themselves completely, without apology, without permission, without the slow, careful negotiation with convention that most people spend their whole lives conducting. When two people like that end up in the same room, something happens. Something always happens. The party, and the moment it changed. 1972, A House in the Hills. The kind of party that only existed in that specific moment in history, that narrow window in Hollywood, in the music world, in the counterculture, in the martial arts world, all briefly occupied the same social space. When Warren Beatty and Miles Davis and karate champions and record producers could all end up in the same living room without it being a planned event. Bruce Lee was there because Enter the Dragon was in post-production, and he was becoming impossible to ignore. The industry was circling him, producers, directors, studio people who had turned him down 3 years ago and were now rethinking everything. Bob Dylan was there because Bob Dylan went where he wanted to go. No other explanation was ever necessary. They were on opposite sides of the room for the first hour. Dylan, as people who knew him in that era will tell you, was not easy at parties. He was not the warm, expansive presence you might imagine. He was watchful, quiet in crowds, a man who processed rooms from the perimeter rather than the center. Bruce Lee was the opposite. He moved through social spaces with the same effortless fluidity he moved through everything else. Warm, curious, genuinely interested in everyone he talked to. The kind of person who makes you feel, for the duration of your conversation with him, like you are the most interesting person at the party. For an hour they existed in the same room without connecting. Then someone, no one has ever claimed credit for this, which is suspicious in a room full of people who like credit, introduced them. And the hour that followed is the reason this story exists. What Dylan said first. The introduction was made. Names exchanged. Dylan looked at Bruce Lee the way Dylan looked at most people at parties, carefully, from behind that particular stillness of his. Not unfriendly, not warm, just watching, collecting data. He said, according to people standing nearby, "I know who you are. I've seen you on television." Not particularly effusive, not the opening of a great friendship, just an acknowledgement. Bruce Lee smiled, said he knew Dylan's work, which was true. Bruce Lee had wide and eclectic tastes that regularly surprised people who expected a martial artist to have a martial artist cultural diet. They talked briefly about music, about what Dylan was working on, about the film Bruce Lee was finishing. Normal party conversation, nothing remarkable. And then someone nearby, trying to be entertaining, trying to generate a moment, said to Dylan, "You should see this guy move. Seriously, it's not like anything you've ever seen." Dylan looked at the person who said this, then looked back at Bruce Lee, said nothing for a moment, then, "Show me." 2 words, flat. Not a performance of curiosity, actual curiosity, the real thing. Bruce Lee looked at him steadily for 1 second, then nodded. And the party, without anyone announcing it, quietly rearranged itself around what happened next. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. Bruce Lee did in someone's living room. There was no mat, no space cleared, no preparation of any kind. Bruce Lee simply moved, right there, between the furniture and the guests and the half-empty glasses and the cigarette smoke. In a living room in the Hollywood Hills like it was the most natural thing in the world. What he did was not a kata, not a rehearsed sequence, not the kind of demonstration you do when you are trying to impress a crowd. It was something closer to what musicians call improvisation. Pure, present moment movement responding to the space he was in. Fast and slow in the same breath. Explosive and perfectly controlled in the same instant. Moving through the room the way water moves. Finding every available path without effort, without force, without the slightest wasted energy. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that no one has a category for. People who had been mid-sentence stopped mid-sentence. People who had been laughing forgot what they were laughing at. A woman near the window later said she felt the hair on her arms stand up and didn't understand why until she thought about it afterward. Bruce Lee moved for maybe 45 seconds, then stopped, completely still, as if he had never moved at all. Nobody said anything for 3 full seconds, and then the room exhaled. People started talking all at once, exclaiming, reaching for words that weren't quite adequate. But Bob Dylan said nothing. He stood exactly where he had been standing, and he was looking at Bruce Lee with an expression that people who were there have described in different ways over the years. But they all agree on one thing. It was not the expression of a man who had just been impressed by a trick. It was the expression of a man who had just recognized something. The way you recognize a piece of music that says something you had been trying to say for years but hadn't found the words for yet. The conversation that lasted until midnight. The movement stopped. After the room found its voice again, Dylan walked over to Bruce Lee, quietly, ignoring everyone else in the room with the particular focused rudeness that creative people sometimes deploy when they have found something genuinely interesting. He said, "What is that? What do you call that?" Bruce Lee thought for a moment, then said, "I don't call it anything. Naming it would make it smaller than it is." Dylan looked at him, and for the first time that evening, something in his face shifted. The watchfulness became something warmer, something more open. He said, "I know exactly what you mean." They found a corner, 2 chairs, and they talked for almost 2 hours while the party moved around them like a river around 2 rocks. Nobody recorded the conversation. Nobody was taking notes. The people who drifted close enough to hear fragments reported back pieces that don't add up to a complete picture, but gesture towards something extraordinary. They talked about the relationship between discipline and freedom, about how you spend years learning rules in order to earn the right to forget them, about what happens in the moment of creation, whether it is a punch or a lyric or a chord change. When the thinking stops and something else takes over. Dylan talked about songs that wrote themselves, the ones that arrived complete, that he felt less like he had written and more like he had received. The ones he didn't understand until years later, sometimes never. Bruce Lee talked about movement that came from somewhere beneath conscious decision. The state he trained toward, not a technique, not a method, but a complete absence of the gap between thought and action. Two different languages, the same country. At some point past midnight, the party had thinned out significantly. Dylan stood to leave. He shook Bruce Lee's hand, started toward the door, then stopped, turned back, said something that the one person still close enough to hear it has never been entirely sure they heard correctly. It sounded like, "You move the way a song feels when it's right." Then he left. The morning after, the song Nobody Can Explain. Bob Dylan's process was not a mystery to the people who worked with him. He was not a careful, methodical writer who built songs brick by brick over months. He was a receiver. Something would arrive, a phrase, a feeling, an image, and he would follow it immediately, urgently, before it could dissolve back into whatever place it came from. He had learned over the years to trust this, to drop everything when it came, to write through the night if that was what it took. Because the things that came from that place, the real place, the deep place, were always better than the things he constructed deliberately. The morning after the party, his assistant arrived at his house and found him at the kitchen table. Papers spread out, a guitar leaning against the chair, coffee going cold beside him. He had been there since 5 a.m. He looked up, said only, "Don't talk to me yet." The assistant left, came back 2 hours later. Dylan was still at the table, but something had changed in his face. The concentrated urgency of the morning was settling into something quieter. The particular stillness of a man who has finished something and is now living in the exhale of it. He looked up at the assistant and said, "I met someone last night who reminded me what I'm supposed to be doing." The assistant asked what he meant. Dylan picked up the papers from the table, looked at them, set them back down. "He doesn't think about moving," he said. "He just moves. And somehow everything he does is exactly right. Not perfect, right. There's a difference." He paused, looked out the window. "I spend too much time thinking about the song," he said. "He made me remember that the song already exists. I just have to get out of its way." If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The climax, the song, and the secret. Here is where the story arrives at something that cannot be confirmed and cannot be denied. In the months following that party, Dylan released material that people close to him described as a return to something essential, a stripping away, songs that felt less constructed and more discovered, less performed and more inhabited. The critics noticed. They wrote about a new directness, a presence in the recordings that had been missing for a period, a quality of someone who had stopped worrying about the song and started trusting it. Dylan was asked in interviews what had changed. What was different about this period? He gave different answers each time, which was typical. But across all the different answers, there was a consistent thread. Something about having been reminded of what it felt like to move without thinking about moving. One interviewer pressed him, asked him to be more specific about what had reminded him. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I met someone who had completely solved something I'm still working on. It made me want to work harder, and differently." The interviewer asked, "Who?" Dylan smiled, said nothing, moved on. But the people who were at that party in the Hollywood Hills in 1972, the ones who watched two of the most original minds of the 20th century sit in 2 chairs and talk until midnight, they know exactly who he meant. What Bruce Lee gave Dylan without knowing it. Here's the thing about Bruce Lee that this story illuminates more clearly than almost any other. His effect on people was not limited to fighters, not limited to athletes, not limited to people who cared about martial arts or physical movement at all. He affected everyone who encountered him at depth. Because what he had mastered was not a fighting system. What he had mastered was presence. Complete, undivided, total presence in the moment he was in. And that That specific quality speaks to every human being regardless of what field they work in, because every field has the same enemy. The gap between you and the thing you are doing. The thinking about it instead of being inside it. The preparation that becomes a wall instead of a door. Dylan felt it in 45 seconds of watching Bruce Lee move in a living room. Felt it the way you feel the right key fitting a lock. The recognition of something you have been reaching for, embodied completely by someone else. That is the rarest gift one human being can give another. Not instruction, not advice, not a method or a system or a philosophy. Just being so completely yourself that the people around you remember what that feels like and go home wanting it. The one thing this is really about. The version of excellence that the world rewards and recognizes and understands. Technically perfect, thoroughly prepared, consistently delivered. And then there is the other version, the one that is harder to name and harder to achieve and impossible to fake for even a moment. The version where you have gone so far into what you do that the doing and the being become the same thing, where the song and the singer are not separate, where the fighter and the fight are not separate, where the gap closes entirely and what is left is just truth expressed through a human body. Bob Dylan spent his life reaching for that in music. He found it sometimes, in the recordings that still make you feel like something true is happening, like you are hearing someone say something real rather than something constructed. Bruce Lee lived there, full-time, without effort. Not because he was born there, he trained his way there, through years of deliberate and demanding work, but because he had done the work completely enough that the work had become invisible. He moved the way a song feels when it's right, and if you are working at anything at all, that sentence is worth carrying with you. Not the perfection, not the technique, the rightness, the feeling of being entirely inside what you are doing with nothing left over. That is what Bruce Lee showed Bob Dylan in 45 seconds in a living room in the Hollywood Hills. And Dylan went home and wrote something he could not have written the day before.